You know, during Classroom of the Elite, Ayanokoji, our main protagonist, says something really interesting at the start of the show.
突然だが、少し考えてみてほしい。人は平等であるか否か。現代社会は平等平等と訴えてやまない。ある偉人が、天は人の上に人を作らず、人の下にも人を作らず、と言った。だがこれには続きがある。生まれた時は平等だが、その後に差が生まれるのは、学問に励んだか励まなかったか、そこに違いが生じる、と。とにもかくにも、人間は考えることのできる生き物だ。平等という言葉は、嘘偽りだらけだが、不平等もまた、受け入れがたい事実であるということ。
Ayanokoji basically questions, are people truly equal? And let me ask you the same question. Do you think that human beings are people who are truly equal to each other? Now, as you think about this, let me take you through what Ayanokoji was trying to say at the end of the day, and the philosophies behind all his thoughts. It's going to be a long video, but I promise I'll try to make it as engaging as possible. I'll ask you guys questions throughout, so hopefully it gives you some more shower thoughts. So here we go. You know, as I was analyzing this quote, I thought it actually didn't really make sense. And that's when I remembered that Classroom of the Elite was actually originally a light novel series. So I thought things would have been a little lost in the translation, and lo and behold, when I searched up the translation for the light novel, Ayanokoji actually explains his thought in much more detail. Alright, so the first part actually stays consistent with the anime, obviously, right? He asks if people are truly equal to each other. He continues to elaborate on this in the light novel and says that society is constantly shouting to get rid of inequality, and quotes the example that society wants women to be in equal paying jobs and for people to stop calling disabled people disabled because that's kind of offensive. And finally, he says that children are being taught that everyone is equal, but he wonders if that's truly the case. He goes on and asks if this is really true and says that men and women's abilities are just inherently different, and people who are disabled essentially are still disabled despite your efforts trying to tell them otherwise. And finally, he says that the answer to his question that he proposed is no, people are not equal at the end of the day. He then goes on to quote this famous philosopher who says that God did not make anyone above or below another, and says that society likes to quote this guy, throwing his quotes around to support their arguments that everyone is equal. But then he still argues that people are at the end of the day unequal to each other. And his counter-argument to all of this is that people who quote this guy doesn't know what he says in the latter half of his quote. And in the second half of the quote, the philosopher basically says, well, if people are truly equal at birth, then why are there differences in people's social statuses and people's jobs? This philosopher essentially questions if this comes from because they didn't understand academics or they just didn't try hard enough. Finally, he goes on to mention that people are beings who are capable of thinking, and says that he doesn't think it's correct to say that people should live on using only instincts because things aren't fair. And at the end of the day, he says that equality is full of lies, but inequality, on the other hand, is still unacceptable. And in the end, he was trying to find a solution to this eternal problem that was facing all of humanity. Alright, I know that was a lot to digest, but let me just break it down for you and go one step at a time with examples. To understand what he means by his quote, we have to understand why we like the concept of equality in the first place. So let me ask you this. Why do you think that people like to chase the idea of equality? And the answer to that is actually very simple. It's because we as human beings want to be treated fairly. And this is a key word, fair, because we'd hate it if someone, was just unequal to us, because at the end of the day, that's just not fair. So now we understand why everybody chases for equality and why inequality is essentially unacceptable. It's because unequal is synonymous with being unfair. But Ayanokoji basically argues that this is not the end, because equality promises things to be fair, but in reality, he says that's not really true. Well, then the next question would be, how does equality promise fairness but not end up delivering it? So I want to ask you, what do you think is fair? All right. And let me give you a scenario. Is it the case that you have what I have? I think that's a very basic surface level idea of fairness. Would that be fair to you? Let's say you had $1 million, right? And I had $10,000. And I'm out here saying, wait, that's unfair, and raising my pitchforks and, starting fires all over town saying that's unfair. Well, would I be able to accept the fact that maybe you got your 10 million through your sheer hard work? If you grinded for 10 years and earned that 10 million, I think I would be okay with saying, yeah, that's fair. If, for example, you earned that through your hard work and I spent my time lounging around, and which is why I ended up with 10,000, you ended up with 1 million. I would be more or less okay with that, even though, I'd be a bit salty, but hey, that's life, right? So in other words, just to summarize, equality presents us with the idea that everyone at the end of the day will be treated fairly. However, we've just discovered that, okay, it depends on certain things, such as, if you worked hard for it, and that we don't really want a surface level outcome of equality. At the end of the day, being equal does not mean exactly fair, and being unequal does not necessarily being unfair. So let me move on to another question, and another simple example actually. So let's say I have $10 million again, and you have $10,000. Now, let's say I didn't get that $10 million from my own efforts, right? Let's say my dad gave it to me. Would you say this is unfair or fair? Now, obviously, I can't read your mind through a camera, but you would probably also be screaming and raising your pitchforks and saying, no, that's unfair, that's unfair. And let me ask you, why do you think this is unfair? Well, as we previously discussed, it's because this idea of merit, right? I didn't earn any of that 10 million, right? It was a hand-me-down because I happened to be born into a rich family. Therefore, I got to where I am now today because of it. I did not work hard, and I was just lucky to be born that way. And that's what makes it inherently unfair. So essentially, you agree with the idea that luck should not be a determining factor, because at the end of the day, that would mean it's unfair, and it should be solely your own merits, your own effort that puts you to where you are today. And that's the idea behind equality, right? You would only be able to accept inequality if I worked for it. Obviously, it's unfair that luck and circumstance determines where we get in life, which is why you would probably most likely agree with the fact that we should eliminate those factors as much as possible for people to be truly equal to each other. And this is exactly what the school in the classroom of the elite tries to do. It establishes a system where students can essentially move up based on merit. And this would be done by achieving both higher individual test scores as well as raising the overall class performance. So let me give you an example. Let's say company A is hiring for a job. You have to hand in a resume, which is a sheet of paper with, your list of achievements so far in life. So you're supposed to give this resume, but instead you won't put your name on it, and, they'll take off your picture. And instead you're labeled by numbers, right? So applicant 1, applicant 2, blah, 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 blah. That way they don't have any sort of biases, within the hiring team, okay? Now, let me ask you a question now. Would this be fair, right? Would this be fair? Now think about it. Some of you might be saying, yeah, this is totally equal, this is totally of equal opportunity, right? A chance for all of us to shine based on, our effort and our achievements. But some of you might be like, no, wait a minute, right? Let's go back to if I had $10 million and you had $10,000. I would be, in a position where I would have so much more opportunities. And so wouldn't I get the job much more easier than you would get the job? And you would be like, no, that's unfair, right? We should fix that. This is the second part of the problem, is that it's hard to isolate for circumstance. I don't know why I'm doing these weird hand motions. It comes with practice. I don't know, it helps me speak. Okay, but anyways. Which brings me to the hardest question of them all. How do you isolate for this, right? How do you isolate for the factor that is merit? Is there a way to have the poor person in that scenario have an equal fighting chance against the rich person who just started lucky in life? So what if the solution was that, okay, well, if there was a way, let's say we can give the poor kid $10 million to compete with the rich kid and elevate him so that he's on an equal playing field. Would that solve the problem? Well then, let me ask you a very simple question then. If the poor kid had the same amount of money as the rich kid, who do you think would have the job at the end of the day? The very simple answer to that is that the person who is smarter will obviously get the job. Well, I don't know what the job depends on, but let's say it's a job involving smarts, right? The smarter person will get the job, and that's a key factor. And you might say to this, well, obviously the smarter person gets the job, right? I think that's fair. Well, is it fair though? Because we've established that the only thing that makes things fair in an unequal world is this idea of meritocracy. If I earned it through my hard work. So let me ask you, does the person who get the job, should that be the smartest person? Or should that be the person who works the hardest? Which brings me to my next example. So for this next example, we're going to make it slightly easier to understand because at the end of the day, smarts can be a difficult concept to grasp. Let's say that now we're all running a race around a racetrack. And let's say we've established some rules. We open the racetrack to everyone. And let's say we give everybody the same amount of resources. We give everyone the same facilities, same everything. And all there's left to it is effort, the amount of effort you put in. Right? Well, no. Now this is the key point, right? This is the key point, and you have to pay attention to this, is because the person who essentially is going to win the race is not necessarily always going to be the person who works the hardest. We've determined that effort is the only thing that makes it fair, because the fastest runner is obviously going to win the race. But the fastest runner is not always going to be the person who tried the hardest. And at the end of the day, that would inherently be unfair. If we take Usain Bolt and put him up against me, even if we both trained the same amount of time, 10 hours a day, he's going to win the race. And why is that? Well, maybe he's got long legs, maybe he's got long limbs. I don't know the physics behind what makes him a fast runner, but undoubtedly he has a natural talent for this. And it's inherently unfair for me to work 3-4 hours versus if Usain Bolt even works half the time, maybe a quarter of the time even, and still gets more results than me, even though we're training different amounts of times. Even if we're training the same amount of times, maybe the talented person will ultimately come out on top because he's literally just talented. So in other words, it wasn't Usain Bolt's fault that he was born with long legs, nor did he work for his long legs. Yes, he did put in the effort, but what I'm saying is that talent is undoubtedly a factor if we make everything else an even playing field. Now that we know it's unfair, let's circle back to the question of equality. Now, equality promises that everyone will be treated fairly, but people, as Ayanokoji mentions, are inherently different. Right? Or people are just born with different talents. Usain Bolt is born with long legs. Some people are born disabled. That's just how it is. So the question then becomes, well, the concept of equality promises fairness, and how do we fix this innate talent? So let me go back to my silly example for a minute. Let's say Usain Bolt and me were running a race. Now let's say that I get to start 200 meters earlier, and Usain Bolt still beats me. Well, in fact, he smokes me, even though we train for the same amount of time a day. Now let's say, okay, everybody looks at this and it goes like, no, that's unfair, right? Usain Bolt can run crazily fast. Now, let's say that instead of 200 meters earlier, let's say I get to start 400 meters earlier. And he still smokes me, right? Because I'm just that bad at running. Society again looks at this and goes like, that's unfair, right? We should change that. And then I get to start a lap earlier. Until finally, maybe I get to start 2 laps earlier. He has to run 4 laps, I have to run 2. And I finally finish the race at the same time as Usain Bolt. Now, would this be fair? Is this fair? Yes, because we're minimizing Usain Bolt's innate talent, right? I mean, surely. But as we originally discovered, this is exactly the problem, right? This is the paradox. So in other words, if we finish racing at the same time, and if I train for 10 hours, you train for 10 hours, and I get a 2-lap head start, well, what's the point of training in the first place? In other words, we don't really want this equality of outcome. And that's exactly the problem with it. So with every branch that we've explored so far, it seems like we can't really find a practical solution to equality, right? Talent and luck are just innate factors of reality, and Ayanokoji is basically saying that. He's saying that people are born unequal, and he says that it's a difficult thing for people to accept. And Ayanokoji realizes this. He realizes that we can't really make everyone truly equal at the end of the day, which is why he says that equality is full of lies and falsehood. But he also realizes that inequality is something inherently unacceptable. So at the end of the day, he was just trying to figure out a solution. And his solution, just simply to appear to be equal. See, there's a second instance when Ayanokoji brings up this question. This is at the end of episode 3, where Sudo, the red-haired basketball player, had just failed the midterm exam by 1 single point. Ayanokoji meets Class D's homeroom teacher at the rooftop, and there he poses the exact same question to her.
どうした?もうすぐ授業が始まるぞ。
先生、一つ質問させてもらってもいいでしょうか。
質問?
今の日本は、この社会は平等だと思いますか？
ずいぶんとぶっ飛んだ話だな。私がそれに答えて意味があるのか?
大事なことです。答えてもらえませんか？
私なりの見解で言えば、当然世の中は平等じゃない。少しもな。
俺もそう思います。平等なんて言葉は偽りだと。でも俺たち人間は考えることのできる生物です。
何が言いたい?
ルールは平等に適用されているように見えなければならないということですよ。
ほう。何のつもりだ?
須藤の英語の点数1点売ってください。
The rules have to at least have the appearance of equal application. Ayanokoji says that we are not equal, and that the pursuit of equality may ultimately be a futile endeavor. However, because people realize that inequality is unacceptable, perhaps the only thing to do is simply to appear to be equal.